So, you might ask, why leaving home in the first place? Well, we're dealing with the 20th century, and music, like all the arts, cannot but reflect its own time. It's been a century of mass immigration and exile, and we'll see what a profound effect that's had on music. But leaving home is also the dominant metaphor for a time in which all the certainties, be they social, political, or artistic, had migrated. Music itself left home in countless ways. It left behind structures and forms which were becoming ossified, and the predictable pitches and harmonies which were their bedfellows. The comforting hierarchies of tonality, the safe foundation of rhythm, all these things were no longer dependable. Rhythm had long seemed something organic and regular, like footsteps or the heartbeat, not to be meddled with. But in the music which became the century's heartbeat, everything was to be questioned. All the certainties were up for grabs. Rhythm is a catch-all word. Pulse, vibration, breathing, even ripples on the water's surface. Now we're looking at the time when everything in the arts was going to change, and not only the arts, but everything that affected the arts around it. This was a time in which man's internal rhythms were more affected by the outside world than ever before. The actual speed with which life moved changed at an unconscionable rate at the beginning of the century. If rhythm had been measured before by the heartbeat, by the pulse, with all its strange, cranky, individual humanity, the 20th century was a time in which rhythm would be measured in a much more exact way. It's probably no accident that Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, which is really the seminal work of the 20th century in so many ways, happened in 1913, just before the greatest conflagration that the world had ever known. Stravinsky talked of trying to recapture the violence, this sense of the earth cracking open that he witnessed every spring in Russia. But on a deeper level, it's a musical metaphor for the vessel of an exhausted era cracking open. In some ways, Rhythmic regularity was probably the thing most taken for granted by listeners before this century. Our ears have become used to hearing patterns repeated over and over again, providing the underpinning for all the melodies and harmonies of music we know well. It's a little like the metal framework of a large building. Once the plaster and paint are on, we forget it's there at all. But take that framework away, and the whole building falls down. Now, what Stravinsky did in The Rite of Spring was not to take away the underpinning, but to remove any sense of predictable repetition. For the audience at the premiere, it must have felt like the building was indeed falling down, and on top of them at that. Rhythm in Western music before this century was usually written in either duple or triple meter. That is, based on groups of 2. 1, 2, 1, 2, my own composition, or in groups of 3. The repeated groups of 2 or 3 kept music ticking along. But one thing The Rite of Spring never does is just tick along. It jumps, it leaps, it hiccups, and it stamps. The 2s and 3s are thrown together without pattern, without balance, and suddenly we're in a violent asymmetric universe. If the years up to 1914 marked the end of the old order, then the modern age, the age of cities, skyscrapers, motorised speed, started in 1918. Edgar Varèse emigrated from France to America, and he found his true new world in New York. The impact of the city transformed him into music's skyscraper mystic.
Today is an age of speed, synthesis and dynamics. Consequently, we expect contemporary forms to reflect those qualities. I tell people I am not a musician. I work with rhythms, frequencies and intensities. Tunes are merely the gossips in music.
One of Varèse's great gifts to the 20th century was his demonstration that percussion instruments could take on the whole substance of music just as successfully as any other section. Of course, percussion instruments form the foundation of a whole wealth of non-Western music through the ages. But in classical music, it was a real revolution. The orchestra for ionization consists entirely of percussion, and it's used with an astonishing ear for collage. It's also, until the end, made up entirely of unpitched sounds, so that even the main themes are purely rhythms, which are so used to being the skeleton beneath the flesh, but so unused to carrying the entire weight of music. But the sound that everybody always remembers from this music is the lonely city sound of the siren, which is not just something sinister, but is the only sustaining sound in the first part of the piece. In fact, it almost takes the place of melody. For centuries, music was guided by a strictly audible pulse, a reflection of clear social hierarchies as much as anything else. Simplistically, the blurring of social orders seemed to liberate the hierarchies of rhythm. The pulse was there, even if buffeted by the stormy weather of Romanticism. But by the end of Gustav Mahler's life, coincidentally, shortly before the birth of the right, even if the pulse was still tethered, the rhythms above it were floating high in the stratosphere. This is the place where rhythm has moved away from the tangible, the physical, over to the metaphysical. Mahler was a great transitional figure between the 19th and the 20th century. And in fact, a whole swathe of the music of our century is unthinkable without him. The Abschied from the Song of the Earth, one of Mahler's late masterpieces, is like a message from the other side. It's a philosophical tract, searching for peace and a sense of the eternal in a time of conflict. In this, it's blood brother to another great transitional masterpiece, the slow movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. By listening to both of them, we can see the way in which music was going to change. Beethoven's magnificent arching melody is underpinned by a steady pulse, like some giant clock or pendulum. In Das Lied von der Erde, Mahler somehow uses his own version of the same theme. And so, if you think of refracted 100 years later, you might come up with the Mahler, using so many of even the same notes, is, in comparison, floating in outer space. The rhythm has become infinitely flexible, and it just approaches a kind of floating incoherence before returning straight to the heartbeat. some of Mahler's music seems to look down on the earth from a great distance. Our next piece, the Hungarian composer Ligety's Atmospheres, was memorably used by Stanley Kubrick in his film 2001 to represent the sensation of actually being in outer space.
My music is a continuous flow, unbroken by bars, like a Gregorian melody. I tend towards something irregular and freakish. Music should not be normal, well-bred, with its tie all neat.
At first encounter, atmosphere seems to be entirely just to do with texture. But the more one listens, the more one gets the impression of movement. There is a theory that the universe expands and contracts in a kind of cosmic deep breathing. Ligeti starts from this. This comes across as a vibration. Countless tiny little cells begin to appear throughout the orchestra. Each string player is playing different fast rhythms from the others. In fact, so fast that the ear can't make them out individually. After the Second World War, composers were looking to reinvent every facet of their language. Even rhythm needed to be re-examined. We talked earlier of the way the 20th century replaced the organic heartbeat pulse with the precision and total reliability of the clock or mechanical time. Steve Reich, in Music for Pieces of Wood, has just simply taken the most extreme form of clock time and made it into music. Reich turned to Africa for his inspiration. And this was only possible because another way of leaving home this century has been travel. The development of advanced means of transport has meant that many artists have had access to cultural input from all over the world. Taking off from the multi-layered feel of African music, Reich builds up more and more complex tessellations of rhythm from the most basic beginning. The idea is that the audience should gradually be drawn into the hypnotic state of it. And listening to this music is very much a matter of a state of mind. It can feel like being strapped down to a bed under the leaking roof from hell, not being able to do anything about mending the drips. Or it can be a gradual insertion into the complexities of rhythm. It can be very, very fascinating. It can be very joyful. Some people's journey towards rhythm has been more eccentric, none more so maybe than Conlon Nancarrow. Exiled as a result of being an undesirable alien, thanks to his activities in the Spanish Civil War, he spent a lot of the post-war years in Mexico working with a player piano. Machine music, which later evolved into electronic music, gave the composer unlimited possibilities of digital dexterity. Now, it's not just that a pair of mere human hands couldn't get round these notes, but actually, you'd need two or more brains even to control the hands. The combination of rhythms is just too much to take in. But somehow, it doesn't sound totally inhuman. Nancarrow's music has the cranky, handmade quality of some of Tangley's friendly machines. But the machines sound as though they're on some life-threatening acceleration medicine. don't know whether Conlon Nancarrow had ever heard Art Tatum playing, but hearing the two juxtaposed, as I did one day, was a very startling experience. Because Art Tatum was producing, by sheer improvisation, a very similar type of effect than Nancarrow was by his very patient etching into paper. The visit to the great Paris exhibition at the end of the 19th century by a gamelan orchestra from Peliatan in Bali was a turning point both literally and symbolically for all the artists and composers who saw and heard it. Here was music where rhythm was almost all, but with a flexibility and complexity that Western music could only dream of. Debussy was the first composer to explore all these new resources. But looking through the century, many composers, among them Messiaen, Boulez and Britten, have been deeply affected by the magical sounds of the Indonesian gamelan. Pierre Boulez, in his piece Rituel in Memoriam Moderna, sets up a means by which rhythms can almost collide by chance, but they remain both audible and affecting. The sounds of Indonesia are embedded deep in this music, but they've been abstracted so that only their essence remains. Boulez calls the piece a ceremony of remembrance and extinction, and the way in which these musics appear and gradually dissolve is very moving, very simple, very still. Physically, it's quite simple to describe. There are little groups of players with their own percussionist. The percussionist does not follow the conductor, but follows the players. The players have lines which flow into a rhythm, and the percussionist catches them like someone at a circus and plays a pulse. There are gongs tolling like bells. There are brass chords giving solemnity. There's the idea of an incanting oboe wailing its loss. In between the free sections, the whole orchestra responds with its own amens. Funereal chords coming from all sides, like voices from a crowd remembering. Is there still a place in the 20th century for rhythm to be emotional? The kind of visceral force that's made people jump and dance over the centuries? The answer is resoundingly yes, and our last piece is a celebration in sound of the sheer joy of living. This is actually literally true, because Messiaen had spent the early years of the Second World War in a prisoner of war camp, certain that he would not survive. The huge Turanga Lila Symphony, written just after the end of the war, is a hymn of life, love, and a kind of ecstasy that covers the ground between highly charged religious faith and eroticism. Turanga Lila is a compound word in Sanskrit, and it's pregnant with many different meanings. Turanga means time, movement, and most significantly, rhythm, while Lila means act, signifying the divine areas of creation and destruction, life and death. Messiaen described the inspiration for the piece as the joy conceived by one who's only glimpsed it in the midst of misfortune. That is to say, a superhuman joy, overflowing, blinding, and limitless. This is the fifth movement of Turanga Lila, and it's called Joy of the Blood of the Stars, the kind of title only Messiaen would have thought of, and actually only he could even get away with. The orchestra becomes one vast rhythmic laboratory, each group of instruments fulfilling different complementary roles. The strings have been employed either like a flapping of wings and feathers in the violins, or in great stampedes of heavy beasts in the bass. And of course, one's immediately struck by the instrument that Messiaen loved so much, the en martineau. In another nod to Bali, Messiaen has created his own homemade gamelan out of the piano soloist and all the other metal percussion instruments. Just at the point that the rhythm threatens to cross the thin line between complexity and chaos, it's sharply jerked back to the main current of energy. It makes me think of myriads of hyperactive planets circling a vast pulsing sun. If rhythm is primarily an expression of the life force, who better to be our guide than Olivier Messiaen?